That's ridiculous, Miranda said, seething. She couldn't believe Charles would agree to such a reckless request. She had witnessed the terrifying strength of the Death Legion, and she knew they didn't have enough reinforcements to fight a war with such powerful foes. So it was baffling to her that Charles would agree to fight. I didn't ask for reinforcements because an ordinary army wouldn't stand a chance against the Death Legion, Charles explained to everyone in the tent. If they suffered heavy casualties, it would affect their morale. But don't worry, I won't have to resort to any risky tactics because we already have the advantage in this war. We have the advantage? Harper asked incredulously. Isn't the Death Legion the biggest threat there is? Charles shook his head. In a war where neither side has an overwhelming advantage, overall strength is what will decide the outcome, and logistics are very important. He pointed outside. The black snow is already a foot deep. Haven't you considered how to solve the problem of not having a clean water source? The water problem is troubling, all right, Calvin said. Even after being purified with light and boiled for 15 minutes, some of the polluted water can still make people sick. It needs to be purified even further. In the new era, food and water was always the main concern. Although it may look like we're at a disadvantage, Charles said, it's actually the enemy who have turned themselves into an isolated island. They may control 4 war zones, but they've cut themselves off from the outside world and have no one they can ask for aid. Their supplies are dwindling, and even if they prepared for that, there's no way they have enough water. Baltimore had plenty of natural water sources, but the water in Washington had been heavily polluted, so he figured that Leonard and his army were probably scrambling to get the proper equipment ready to clean the water. Of course, there was no shortage of water in Dawn City due to Charles's own efforts, but everyone else in the world acutely understood the importance of obtaining water. Charles took out a water-repelling pearl. If you put this in your mouth, water will avoid you, he said, but if you put it directly in the water, it'll remove all the impurities. Water purified with this won't last for a long time, but it's better than drinking polluted water. The water-repelling pearl essentially created distilled water. It wasn't the best water to drink, as all the minerals had been stripped from it, but Charles knew that was a small price to pay. Drinking the polluted water would be even more hazardous to your health. Everyone's eyes lit up. They had forgotten about the water-repelling pearl. With it, at least they didn't have to worry about finding a source of clean water. Besides, Charles continued, I've already confirmed that the food supplies in the remaining war zones are enough for 80,000 people to eat for a week. And considering how the Shaw family likes to prepare, it might last at least 2 weeks. But we have something they don't. Washington as our backup. Everyone saw the truth in his words. Although Leonard and his family had a formidable reputation, they had offended and alienated too many people, so they were ostracized wherever they went. Without anyone else's support, their supplies wouldn't last long. With the crowd calmed down, Charles went on, and it's the same with guns and ammunition. Leonard is too arrogant to have prepared enough weapons to properly defend the zones. Although guns and ammunition won't damage paranormals, they're still enough to pose a threat, and we've got them beat as far as weapon supplies are concerned. He thought Leonard was an extremely conceited person who hadn't even considered the possibility of failure while preparing for the war. But Leonard knew he couldn't afford to lose either, because failure meant total annihilation. In his haste, he hadn't completed all his preparations, which only proved to Charles that Leonard's army was lacking. Everyone had been shocked when Charles had recklessly chased after Leonard with no regard for his own life, and they were relieved that it seemed he was changing tactics. Alice had been furrowing her brow in anxiety, but she relaxed and heaved a sigh. I'm surprised you're relying on logistics, she said. I was afraid you'd try to win this war with brute force alone. He waved a dismissive hand. Desperate times call for desperate measures. This is a battle of logistics, and we have to treat it as such. But we have to be on our guard. The enemy will surely launch a counterattack rather than starve to death. We'll have to be careful and fight with our backs to our water supply. As long as they maintained their control of the water, they would have the upper hand. Some people became fiercer as they grew desperate, but most would simply collapse under the pressure. It was difficult for ordinary armies to survive without water, and it would be the same for the Death Legion. What about those 80,000 soldiers? Harper asked. With our numbers, we should be fast enough to take out at least 2 of the 4 war zones they control, and maybe more if all goes well. If we can eliminate the threat of those war zones, the military should be able to send us at least 100,000 reinforcements. and even if we don't need the reinforcements, at the very least, we'll have further depleted the enemy's supplies, and their situation will be even more dire. Everyone exchanged excited looks. They thought that was a feasible plan. The Death Legion was the only group that truly posed a threat to them, but tackling the enemy's defensive line of ordinary soldiers didn't seem too difficult a task. But Charles shook his head. It sounded like a good plan, but he knew it would never work out the way they envisioned. "There are 3 problems with that idea," he said. "The first is the question of what we'll do with the war zones if we do manage to take them over. Would we assume control, or would we just let the zombies run rampant? It doesn't matter who controls the war zones, the zombies are still our common enemy. The second problem is that striking fast and hard sounds great, but it'll expose our backs to Leonard. His army could catch up to us and attack us from behind. And the third problem is that if we leave here, no one else will be able to stand up to the Death Legion in our absence." Harper's face paled as Charles shot down her idea with harsh reality. Zack didn't try to comfort Harper. He knew how serious her discussion with Charles was, and that Charles knew best when it came to military matters. A wrong decision could cause thousands of casualties, so personal relationships had to be momentarily set aside. Charles looked at Harper's ashen complexion. "You're very smart," he said, "but you have to understand that in war, strategy is far less important than experience. The best military strategists are those who've learned from the past, so don't talk about things you don't have experience with." He didn't mean to humiliate her, but his words were hurtful all the same. Harper had had enough training that she could let the insult bounce off her skin without taking it to heart. She bit her lip and said, "I understand." Her greatest contribution to the team was her intelligence, and her brain had played a big role in saving the team many times. But it wasn't quite as useful in war. All the intelligence in the world couldn't make up for her lack of combat experience. Military battles in real life were never like they were in the movies, where a few smart strategies could decide the outcome of a war. Some things were more important than strategy. The day passed quickly. After the 3 scattered legions met with Leonard, they wanted to launch a sneak attack on the Allied army. But the army's defenses were too strong, so they gave up on that idea. There were a few isolated fights that day, but no large-scale battles. Leonard met with his army commanders to discuss logistics. He sat and looked gloomy as he absorbed their reports. "What did you say?" he demanded. "We only have enough food for 5 more days? I know this is a nuclear disaster area, so food can't be preserved for very long, but 5 days of food isn't nearly enough. Can we transfer resources from the 4 war zones we control?" In a nuclear disaster area, food deteriorated very quickly, so even if they stored a lot of food there, they wouldn't be able to preserve it for long. Leonard knew the Allied army had enough outside support that they didn't need to worry about food, and that made him bitter. "The resources in the 4 war zones we control are very limited," one of the commanders said. "We could transfer some over urgently, but that's not something we can maintain in the long term." A long silence followed his statement. Then Leonard smashed his fist into the arm of his chair and broke it. "So what if we don't have food?" he shouted. "We're running out, but Arthur and his army have plenty. In that case, I'll follow Charles's example and go all out. If we can take down the enemy within 5 days, then it won't matter how much food we have left." The commanders' faces were filled with excitement. They had been forced into a desperate situation, so their only option was to fight back. They called out in agreement. "Well said! Yeah, if we don't have enough food, then we'll just take it from the enemy. Tell the entire army we're marching against the enemy." But despite their support, Leonard frowned as he thought about Charles. He hadn't had a chance to show his full strength in front of Charles. Instead, he'd been forced into a corner and had even lost his divine weapon. It was the greatest humiliation he had ever suffered, and he wondered if he would really have the chance to fight back the next time he saw Charles. "No, I definitely will," Leonard thought savagely. "I'll show that lunatic." Leonard believed that if it hadn't been for Charles fighting him with no regard for his own life, he would have easily won the fight and kept his pride intact. He still had many Death Legion soldiers under his command, and as long as they were around, he had the strength to crush any kind of enemy. But the elder members of the Shaw family saw Leonard's determination to attack and spoke up against him. An older officer tried to dissuade him. "Don't let the news of insufficient food make you act rashly. Launching an attack now will only lead to chaos. Do you want to die?" "You're just scared because you were useless during the battle," a young paranormal said to the officer.
The only reason we failed last time was because of a momentary negligence. But if General Shaw's given another opportunity, Charles won't stand a chance. He'll die by General Shaw's spear. The news of insufficient food spread quickly that day, and more than 3,000 soldiers fled in the night, causing the morale of the remaining troops to waver. Some of the deserters were captured, but many of them managed to escape, and some even fled to the Allied army camp. Leonard's handsome face was distorted with hatred when he heard about the deserters. "Cowards!" he cried. "They don't even have the courage to face the enemy. Pass on my order to kill all those who have tried to desert. Leave no one alive. Those useless people don't deserve to live." His family appeared once again and tried to reason with him. Charles was able to go all out like he did because he won hundreds of battles in the past, and that gave his soldiers enough confidence to support him, one of the officers said. But a general who just lost a battle won't inspire the same confidence. Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" He shoved his palm against the officer's chest and pierced his heart with a burst of energy. The man spat out a mouthful of blood, surprised that Leonard would attack him for simply voicing his concern. "Do you really think I'll take those cowards seriously?" Leonard whispered in the officer's ear. "Your narrow-minded views have bound you all, making you incapable of understanding ambition. I'll show you how I can trample my enemies under my feet." He released the officer, who crumpled to the ground, and addressed the remaining people who were trying to dissuade him. "Does anyone else have any objections?" They all frantically shook their heads. No, definitely not. "He might have dared to question you, but that's his own problem. It has nothing to do with the rest of us." "We were just giving advice. How can our knowledge possibly compare to yours?" They were horrified that Leonard had killed the officer just because he had criticized Leonard's plan, and they didn't dare voice their own opinions. They didn't relish dying for such an embarrassing reason. "Pass on my order," Leonard commanded. "Everyone must be ready to launch an attack within 2 hours. "Listen up," Leonard shouted to the soldiers in formation. "There's no way out now. Our only choice is to attack the enemy, kill them all, and take their food. We're strong enough to take them on 3-1 if necessary. All of you stay alert. We have 3 hours to take down the enemy's wall, or you'll be punished by military law." The troops under Leonard's command shouted excitedly. No matter their personal opinions, they would do as they were instructed. Most of them cheered, and those who disagreed with this plan didn't dare show it. Leonard's army set off toward the Allied army camp in a grandiose manner. Some of the captives and the super squad members who were out hunting quickly fled back to the camp as soon as they saw Leonard's army approaching. Those who didn't retreat in time were killed by Leonard's vanguard. Due to its sheer size, the approaching army couldn't hide its movements, so the commanders of the Allied army came to the city wall and waited for the enemy to attack. In the previous 2 days, both sides had launched many probing attacks, but there had been no large battles. But as they watched the advancing army's aggressive march, the commanders of the Allied army looked solemn. "I didn't think we'd have a decisive battle so soon," Arthur said. His expression was calm, but there was melancholy in his eyes. "General O'Connor, I have something to ask you," Charles said. "What is it?" he replied. Leonard and his family are usually very calculating with their tactics, and it was always difficult to tell what they were up to, Charles said. Leonard seemed like the type of man who would only attack when he was fully prepared, but after we found out about the Death Legion, he suddenly decided to start a war. He usually acts with foresight and determination, so why would he make a decision this big in only 2 days? I can't help but think poorly of him for his impulsivity. The battle with Leonard 2 days earlier had been an accident, and even Charles had been surprised by Leonard's actions. Charles wasn't sure that battle could be considered a part of the war. Leonard had been able to escape, and even though his heart had been pierced through, he was still alive. But during the confrontation, Leonard's performance hadn't been outstanding, which had surprised Charles. As soon as they had entered the city, Leonard had set up an ambush in the sewers. If it hadn't been for Charles, the super squad wouldn't have been able to take down the stronghold so easily. In any other situation, the explosives in the sewers would have been a big problem. And in the 2 days since then, Leonard hadn't done much at all. He controlled the Death Legion, but he was always at a disadvantage in the sporadic clashes between their soldiers. Leonard used to be a very talented strategist, but unfortunately, he went astray, Arthur said. He held up 2 fingers. There are 2 possibilities. The first is that Leonard still has some backup plans that we've yet to discover. Perhaps even the skirmishes the past 2 days were all part of his plan. The second possibility is that it wasn't Leonard who did all those preparations before. Why do I want it to be the first one? Charles muttered. If it was the first possibility, then the enemy was more powerful than he had thought. But if it was the second, then Charles knew they were in more trouble than he had imagined. Either way, there was no time to think about it further because Leonard's army was launching its attack. The vanguard force was made up of ordinary elite soldiers. They weren't the Death Legion, but they were the true core forces of Leonard's army. Their eyes were filled with excitement, and they shouted as they advanced, "Charge in and snatch the food! Everything we want is just on the other side of that wall. Kill them all!" They had all heard stories of other people putting their lives on the line, and they had never thought they would have the chance to do so themselves. Many of their fellow soldiers who weren't as determined had already been executed for their cowardice, but those remaining were brave. Charles's lip curled. Really? So that's your plan? Do you think you deserve to plunder us? As the vanguard approached the foot of the city wall, Charles reached out his right hand and snapped his fingers. A violent explosion shook the ground beneath Leonard's army, and then the ground collapsed, catching the vanguard troops off guard. Before they even had a chance to attack, they fell into a deep pit full of cold, dark water. They cried out in their confusion, "What's going on? That devious rat! It's so cold. What kind of water is this? This isn't good. We have to get out of here." They couldn't jump out, and there was no time to think of another way to escape. The cold penetrated deep into their bones. The water in the pit was clearly liquid, but it felt colder than ice and started to freeze them with terrifying speed. Then the black lightning dragon flew into the air above them and spat a mouthful of black lightning into the pit, killing many of the vanguard troops. Those who were still alive were paralyzed by the lightning. The 2 armies hadn't even started fighting yet, and Leonard's vanguard had already suffered more than 2,000 casualties. The rest of his soldiers were terrified at the sight of the deadly black lightning dragon. Leonard's expression soured. The battle hadn't even begun, yet his vanguard had already been decimated. He wondered how many more casualties there would be if the battle continued. He didn't really care about the lives of his soldiers, but his plan was just beginning, and he had already encountered a major setback. He gritted his teeth and looked up at Charles on the city wall, his eyes full of fury. "I won't accept this," Leonard said. "I'll kill you." Charles looked down, and when he saw Leonard standing there, his expression softened. Since Leonard was down with his army, he was too far away to kill. But Charles had waited a long time already and had enough patience to wait a little longer. "Just come a bit closer," Charles whispered. "End my waiting. I'm looking forward to killing you." Leonard remained in his position far away, and Charles sighed with disappointment. But Leonard had suffered such a huge loss during the last battle, and he couldn't be expected to take such a risk again. Besides, killing several thousand people, the deep pit full of water also made it more difficult for Leonard's army to launch any subsequent attacks. If they wanted to reach the city wall, they would first have to freeze the water in the pit, or if Earth-type paranormals build a bridge of Earth. But that would use up a lot of their power. "Listen up," Charles shouted from above. "You're all traitors of this military base who have slaughtered your fellow soldiers. If you continue to attack, you'll die as traitors, and everyone will curse your names." A general beside Leonard shouted back at Charles, "Don't look so righteous. Don't you capture people and force them to hunt zombies before you give them any food? If your actions represent the military, then this country will be destroyed in your hands." It was no longer a secret that the Allied army forced people to go out and hunt zombies in exchange for food. Some of those who couldn't bear it had sought refuge with Leonard. Charles didn't care. All that mattered to him was that the Allied army had food, and Leonard's didn't. Leonard didn't care about his own people, and those who thought they could survive by fleeing to him were fooling themselves. "That's right," Charles said. His voice boomed over all the soldiers under Leonard's command. "Even if you surrender and become our captives, you'll still need to hunt zombies and collect their materials to survive." His casual admission sent everyone into an uproar. How despicable! He's trying to trick us into taking a risk. This is all too much. Some people have been thinking of surrendering, but after hearing Charles's conditions, those thoughts were extinguished. The corner of Leonard's mouth lifted in a pleased smile. Charles just got lucky last time, he muttered to himself. That's the only reason he won. But now he's acting like an idiot. Our true enemies are the zombies, not fellow humans, Charles shouted at Leonard's troops. Our weapons should be pointed at our enemies, with our backs to the people we want to protect. You think fighting us will fulfill your dreams, but is it your dream to kill all the people in the country? Is it your dream to wipe out the human race? You think it's cruel to force people to kill zombies to get food, but Leonard's the one who created many of these zombies. You think you're so much better than me, but the food you eat and the salary you receive are only possible because that bastard Leonard killed your friends. Charles's words had a strong impact on Leonard's soldiers. Killing zombies in exchange for food did sound cruel to them, but he was right that they were facing human enemies, and Leonard had indeed killed many of his own soldiers. Enough with your clever words, Charles, Leonard yelled. You're just a hypocrite who uses people. You're not any better than me. With the country under my control, I'll lead it to glory. He turned to his army and ordered, All troops attack. Those who desert now will be killed without mercy. Leonard's army began to charge, but their spirit and energy had waned. His words didn't resonate with them because he had never tried to connect with them. He thought everything he did was right, but not everyone felt the same way. The younger soldiers might have been bewitched by his words, but those old enough to know better were only fighting for their own benefit. Leonard's performance recently had disappointed them. They had hastily launched their grand plan and had then lost the battle, and they were extremely dissatisfied. Charles pointed at the pit full of water. If you want to hold on to your humanity, then give up the battle and jump into the pit. Otherwise you'll die as nothing more than animals. As soon as he finished speaking, the Black Lightning Dragon let out a loud roar and spat a large bolt of black lightning at the soldiers. Miserable screams filled the air. Leonard's paranormals took advantage of the opportunity to build a path to the city wall out of rocks and ice as fast as they could, and some members of the Death Legion charged to the front line fearlessly. Leonard had originally planned for his disposable troops to take the lead, but he knew that if they did so at that moment, they would likely turn on each other. He decided to let the fearless Death Legion soldiers seize the wall as soon as possible. Charles, Miranda, and the others began massacring those at the bottom of the wall, and Tina, Tommy, and Hugh also played a powerful role. In just a few blows, dozens of enemy paranormals died by their hands. Zack and the other elemental paranormals continuously released their magic from afar. The allied soldiers on the front line were all wearing dark iron armor. Many of them weren't the original owners of the sets of armor. Although dark iron armor gave those who wore it a lot of protection, they were also always in the most dangerous places. But even if they died, their fellow soldiers could inherit their armor. While the Death Legion soldiers charged forward without a care for their own lives, the army behind them saw it as an opportunity. With the Death Legion covering them, it would be much easier for them to fight. Charge! An officer shouted. Countless soldiers rushed to the bottom of the city wall. The Earth-type paranormal started to destroy the wall by employing their control over the rocks within it. Large cracks soon appeared on the wall. It's working! One of them shouted. They all looked up in excitement. Encouraged, many of the soldiers started attacking the wall recklessly. Rocks rained down, and the wall began to collapse. Then several thick columns of water burst out from the wall. Under the strong pressure, the entire wall crumbled, and the water gushed out. The soldiers exclaimed in fear. Oh no, retreat! It's too late! The water poured out like a waterfall, turning the area in front of the wall into a large lake. Leonard gritted his teeth. Using such despicable tricks again, he snarled. Is he too much of a coward to fight in person? The space in front of the wall had turned into a vast lake. Countless people had been swept away by the current, or were still struggling within it. It was impossible for them to continue attacking, but Leonard was reluctant to give up. The two generals standing next to Leonard looked at him carefully, and then they turned their heads away. They both thought Leonard was an idiot who blamed others for his mistakes, and that the outcome of this battle was disgraceful. The Black Lightning Dragon danced in the sky, still spitting black lightning, making it even more difficult for those who were struggling in the water to survive. The people on the city wall had long since retreated to the inner wall. Alice walked to the edge and stretched out her hands, and a whirlpool appeared in the middle of the black lake and swept up Leonard's soldiers. Amid a torrent of screams, many people were whisked to the shore. "Retreat," Leonard ordered, feeling helpless. He had no other choice. With the Black Lake in front of the city wall, there was no way his soldiers could progress any further that way. And even if he could attack from the other side, there was no way to know if Charles had made similar preparations there. More than 10,000 of his soldiers were sopping wet. The current hadn't washed some of them ashore out of benevolence. It had soaked their weapons, making their firearms useless, which was a serious blow to their morale. With soggy clothes and no usable weapons, there was nothing more they could do in battle. They needed to regroup if they wanted to continue the fight. As he watched Leonard getting farther and farther away, Charles was filled with doubt. He couldn't believe that this impulsive young man was really Leonard. But he knew that time changed people, so it was reasonable to expect the Leonard he had met in his previous life to be different from the Leonard he saw now. After he had experienced more of the catastrophe of the apocalypse, the Leonard in his past life had been more mature. His wisdom, courage, decisiveness, and ability to strategize had been unparalleled. Any of his opponents had been able to tell he had been a formidable enemy. They had felt the despairing pressure of his presence, even if they hadn't confronted him face to face. But Charles marveled that the gap between the two versions of Leonard could be so great. Impulsivity could easily lead to anger. The Leonard in his new life hadn't thought carefully before the battle, and when he had encountered the unexpected, he had panicked. Is this really the Leonard I once knew? Charles wondered. During the battle 2 days earlier, Leonard had ridden the giant white lion, which had been Leonard's personal mount in Charles's previous life. That fact alone should have erased Charles's doubts about Leonard's identity. He also didn't know anyone who would want to hide Leonard's identity from him. After all, it was unlikely that anyone would guess that Charles had been reborn into a new life. If someone really was able to figure that out, he would admit defeat. That was why he tried not to show off his foreknowledge too much. From his past life experience, Charles knew that Leonard wouldn't suffer too many setbacks in the future, and he considered it impossible for him to undergo such a huge change in such a short period of time. When Leonard had been preparing the Death Legion in Charles's past life, no one had been able to see through the series of plots he had carried out, and there had been a distinct lack of information. Charles knew that in order to recruit so many loyal soldiers without leaking any information, Leonard had to have been a great strategist. Even though he had moved hastily during this last battle, his actions up until that point had been commendable. It was only when he had encountered Charles that he had lost his edge, and had used a risky tactic. He might have underestimated my strength, Charles thought, but would Leonard really put himself in danger like that? With all these factors combined, Charles had a lot of doubts about Leonard's identity. Leonard's plan had been disrupted, and he had launched the attack in a hurry, but he had not performed as well as he usually did. He had done well while forming his troops and fighting the battle 2 days previously, but since then, he had lost that invisible pressure that had made him an excellent general. Charles thought there was no way this was the real Leonard. Lewis noticed Charles's sour face. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Why do you look unhappy even though your plan succeeded?" "We only beat them back," Charles answered, "and it was a surprise attack. We might not succeed the next time we use the same tactic." Lewis patted him on the shoulder. "Don't sound so weary. This war isn't your burden to bear alone." "You're right. This war isn't." Charles trailed off, and his eyes widened as he realized something. "No, I'm not alone," he said slowly. "What's wrong?" Lewis asked again, sensing Charles's worry. "Don't put too much pressure on yourself." Charles ignored Lewis and quickly went to see Arthur. "General O'Connor, do you have any information about the Shaw family?" he asked nervously. "I want to know everything about everyone in their family, especially if Leonard has a brother who looks very similar to him." "Yes," Arthur said. "He has a twin brother named Kingston. He was one of the special forces in the army, and he made great contributions to his country." "Where is he now?" Charles demanded. "He's dead," the adjutant said from behind Charles. His voice was cold. He was General O'Connor's most trusted soldier. 3 years ago, he was on a special mission when he died to protect his teammates. "What about his body?" Charles asked. The adjutant's face turned red. "What are you talking about?" he barked. "His body sank to the bottom of the sea. I saw him during the battle. To give us a chance to retreat, he detonated the bomb himself and died along with our pursuers. Even if we had tried to retrieve his body later, we wouldn't have been able to find it. Charles was stunned. Kingston hadn't hesitated to sacrifice his own life for the adjutant and his other teammates. But something bothered Charles. "I'm sorry to stir up your grief," he said, "but you never saw Kingston's body, right? And the Shaw family is powerful, isn't it?" The adjutant's eyes widened and he asked, "What do you mean?" Arthur turned to Charles with a cold look. "There's no such thing as absolute trust in this world," he said. "If I'm really going to put my confidence in you, you need to explain a few things. You told me that this was your first time in Washington. If that's the case, what are you basing this guesswork on? Is there some conflict between you and Leonard's family? Do you know something we don't? Do you know him better than you're letting on?" The only reason he had trusted Charles up until that point was that he sensed that Charles presented his army's greatest chance of winning the war. If he hadn't seen such promise in him, he would have chosen instead to lead the soldiers by himself. But no matter how intelligent Charles was, there was no way he could have made such an accurate guess about the Shaws based on no information at all. It seemed clear to Arthur that Charles had access to some knowledge or experience that he was keeping to himself. "It's very simple," Charles said. "The Shaw family is famous for its generals and its military experience. If you were a high-ranking member of such a family, would you really be at ease with handing over all your power to a brat like Leonard?" Arthur couldn't think how to respond. He hadn't considered that point. Up until that moment, he thought that Leonard was ambitious, resourceful, and had ample survival skills. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gotten so far with his plans. Although Leonard's behavior in their previous battles had hardly been that of an illustrious general, Arthur understood that war often brings out the worst in people, and nobody can be relied on to make the wisest decisions when under pressure. Besides, Charles's battle tactics were revolutionary, so Arthur thought it was perfectly understandable that he had so easily thrown an unprepared Leonard off in battle. Nevertheless, he couldn't deny that Leonard's combat performance left something to be desired, especially when he took into consideration the family he had been born into. Compared to ordinary soldiers, he was an outstanding commander. And yet, based on his recent performance, Arthur could hardly imagine that the Shaw family's senior officers would consider him as a natural successor to their line. He couldn't imagine how they saw him as anything other than a young whippersnapper, impatient and impulsive. But somehow, he had ended up in control of the family and its army. Even Owen, who Arthur had admired very much, had sacrificed his life for Leonard without hesitation. Arthur couldn't see what Owen had seen in him. Charles took a deep breath. "I'll leave the defense of the city wall to you," he said. "Meanwhile, I'm going to take the Montreal soldiers elsewhere. Nobody follow me there or inquire about it." And with those cryptic words, he left. Arthur stood there frowning, but he couldn't deny his trust that Charles knew what he was doing. In the next hour, the Washington and Montreal troops completely changed their defensive formation. The Montreal soldiers separated from the rest of the army, following Charles and Louis to a separate location. At Charles's order, none but himself and Louis were permitted to enter or exit that space, on pain of death. While the troops were rearranging, Charles entered the energy storage space, where he found the tree ants planting crops and vegetables, as well as building canals and claiming new land. There were so many of them that they were even able to send some of their numbers to assist the Dark Dwarves. Over 2,000 of the tree ants were close to level 3. Although their physical strength couldn't compare to humans of the same level, they were still many times stronger than ordinary humans. Moreover, they were naturally very talented in agriculture, and after Charles had given them some farming tools, their efficiency had increased still further. He'd also helped things along by setting the climate in the energy storage space to ideal conditions for the harvest, although that had taken quite a deal of energy from him. All those elements meant that the total food they had farmed exceeded 2,000 tons. Such a massive amount of sustenance was necessary to fuel the Dark Dwarves, who had a large appetite and whose smithing work demanded a large amount of stamina. Charles was pleased to find that the Dark Dwarves were working in an orderly manner. They had more than 300 children, including around 20 newborns. When he had first brought them to the storage space, only 7 of the dwarves had known how to forge. That was because, while the dwarves were generally skilled in metalcraft, it required a certain amount of experience in order to become fully proficient. After their master had left, the children had no longer had a chance to learn the correct techniques, and the 7 dwarves who had experience in the proper craft had been forced to teach it to as many as they could. However, after a period of practice and learning, Over 100 of the dwarves had learned to forge, although the quality of their work still had room for improvement. Still, it was thanks to them that Charles's dark iron armor was so powerful. Although they had only crafted 800 sets, they were of a very high standard. At the beginning, when only the 7 dwarves had been able to do the actual forging, the rest had crushed and refined the dark iron ore. However, as the number capable of forging had grown, there were 20 working on dark iron armor, while Charles had tasked others with focusing on making more weaponry. A skilled dark dwarf could forge more than 30 weapons a day, while an unskilled one could manage 7 or 8. Even if Charles assigned more of the dwarves to focus on armor, they would still produce at least 800 weapons each day. At that point, the Montreal soldiers had 1 dark iron weapon each, and there was even a surplus. Charles had distributed 4,000 weapons to other soldiers a couple of days earlier. He removed some dark iron ore from the energy storage space and handed the task of crushing and refining it to the Montreal soldiers. And then he passed the refined dark iron to the dark dwarves for a second processing. The process was so efficient that over 200 tons of ore were processed every minute, and at the end of their work, he was left with a set of curved, red blades. "We need to keep attacking," Leonard shouted at one of his commanders. "For 3 days straight, you haven't taken even a single camp," said the commander. "We only have food left for 2 days. Do you really want everyone to starve just so you can say that you didn't stop attacking?" It had been 3 days since they had first realized they were running out of food. In that time, they launched several attacks, but hadn't been able to break the enemy's defensive line. Protected by their dark iron armor, Charles's soldiers presented an obstacle almost as strong as a second wall, blocking any advance and leaving all of Leonard's attacks fruitless. Although the Montreal soldiers had retreated to Charles's secret location, they had given their armor to Arthur's troops, who maintained the seemingly impenetrable defense in the other soldiers' absence. "We have food for 3 days, not 2, said a middle-aged woman sitting on a chair nearby, a smile on her lips. She was Merrill Shaw, Leonard's aunt. "We've lost so many soldiers, with 30,000 casualties and 10,000 who've either defected or been executed, and it's greatly reduced the burden on our supplies." Leonard sighed. "I'm sorry to make you worry about all this," he said. "You must think I'm useless." "Everyone has their strengths," she said. "You have talents in many areas, but you can't expect yourself to be better than everyone around you in every respect. Remember that for all your power, you're still only human, and you can't do everyone's job." Her tone was stern but not angry. "Your greatest skill is your ability to rally people to believe in you. Why not use this to inspire those around you to show their true value and do some of your work for you? At the moment, it's like you've gathered together a whole arsenal of powerful weapons, only to store them in a museum. But the true weapons aren't those that are kept behind glass and never marked, but those that are carried into battle to cut down your enemy and make them tremble in fear." Leonard nodded. "You're right," he said. "So what should I do?" He understood that although he already held most of the family's authority, he would be a fool to lose his family's support. He trusted Merrill completely, and knew that she had many powerful people behind her. He also knew that part of the reason he was acting so rashly was his grief for Owen. "After the last few days, we only have 32,000 soldiers left in the Death Legion," said Merrill. "We need to make sure we don't lose any more. More than any of your other forces, the Death Legion are the ones who are going to help you take over the world. The simple fact is that if we carry on fighting here, we'll lose even more of them. We need to retreat." "You're saying I should give up," said Leonard, dejected. "That's impossible. I've been planning this for too long to throw in the towel now. I'm about to take control of the whole city, and now I'm meant to give up everything I've gained just because we've hit a few setbacks? Impossible. I won't do it." "Look at this," said Merrill, opening a map of the world. She drew a small circle around Washington. "This here is what you're fighting for. But open your eyes and look at how great the world is. This world that you'll one day own every inch of. Is it really worth sacrificing your entire army just to say you won this small spot?" On the map, Leonard could see that Washington was only a drop in the ocean. But if I give up Washington, my very first goal, how can I hope to ever take over the rest of the world? He asked. He couldn't be swayed by any of his aunt's rhetorical tricks. Although he knew that she was speaking very reasonably, he needed to work out the practical application of what she was suggesting before making any decisions about it. You still don't understand what your strength is based on, she said, shaking her head. So let me tell you, your armies are loyal to you. This is your greatest strength. The reason you haven't won against Charles yet isn't because of their disloyalty, but your inferior equipment. But I know what their equipment is made of. It's dark iron. As long as we can find a dark iron vein of our own, we'll be able to craft weapons just as strong as theirs. When we've done that, he won't be a match for us. She paused for a moment to let her words sink in before continuing. There's a big difference between weakness and flexibility. The difference is whether, after making a tactical retreat, you have the courage and wisdom to reconsider your strategy so that you can hit back twice as hard. The question now is, how many of your ideals are you willing to sacrifice in order to triumph in the end? She crossed the room to the door. Before leaving, she turned back and said, You're the Shaw family's greatest hope, Leonard. I hope you'll make the right decision here. The Shaw family's greatest hope, thought Leonard, watching her go. It was only when she had left the room that he realized that his fists had been clenched through her entire speech. The pressure to lead the family felt unbearable. Rather than inspire him, her parting remark made him feel dejected that he had disappointed them so much. It didn't help that he wasn't particularly motivated by ideals like family unity or anything like that. Rather, his main motivation was simply that he didn't want to lose. Besides, the way he saw it, the fact that he had failed so much up to that point was clear proof that the family's faith in him was simply misplaced. As for Merrill's talk about sacrificing his ideals, he couldn't face it. He returned to his room. When he got there, he said to an apparently empty corner, Bring me what I need. Yes, sir, said a voice from the corner. A figure wearing a black hood appeared from the shadows. He bowed to Leonard, and then he left the room. All battle strategies are just means to an end, he thought. If I'm really going to defeat Charles, I need to be stronger. Only with the greatest strength can I crush my enemies. Even if I have to sell my soul, I have to obtain that strength. For all his aunt's talk about his power and promise, his heart was full of humiliation over his defeat by Charles. He couldn't accept the humiliation. He couldn't accept failure. He needed some way to leave his limitations behind, to rise above them once and for all. You've forced my hand, Charles, he thought. You asked for this. Back at the military camp, Arthur and his adjutant tried to pacify the captive enemy soldiers, who were loudly protesting their most recent orders. We don't want to go. You're sending us to our deaths. Over 3,000 of us went out today, and only 200 came back. You can't treat us like this. We haven't been properly fed in ages. Charles came to Arthur's side. What's going on? He asked. 3,000 of these captives went out to gather and trade resources, said the adjutant. We've raised all our prices, so they have to go out more often. In the end, only 180 returned. The others all died? Asked Charles, his heart sinking. I don't know, said the adjutant. But considering the state of Leonard's army, it's unlikely that any of them defected to him. It had become common knowledge that Leonard's army was quickly running out of supplies. Leonard himself had all but spelled it out when he had given the order to launch an all-out attack. However, rather than providing his soldiers with the boost they had needed to win the battle, his order had left their morale even more deteriorated. Countless of his soldiers had defected to Charles's side, trading their firearms for food. Of course, thanks to the Treant and the energy storage space, Charles had no shortage of food, so he had agreed to their requests. Even though they didn't necessarily need the soldiers as firearms, he was pleased to have found another way to weaken Leonard's forces. And until that point, he hadn't cared much what the soldiers had done after trading in their weapons. A messenger arrived. It isn't good news, he said. We went out to find out what happened to the captives, and we were ambushed. We lost more than 500 people, more than 100 of them paranormals. Another messenger was right behind the first. We've detected that parts of the ground are collapsing, he said. We suspect someone is digging tunnels. It's likely that the enemy will try to attack from underground. Charles nodded. He knew that victory was hardly in his grasp, but had a feeling that he was about to face a familiar opponent. Leonard must have killed all the people who went out to hunt, said Arthur, his expression solemn. They seem to have changed their tactics. Has Leonard had some kind of brainwave, or do you think they found another commander? Has anyone defected to us today? Charles asked. No one, said the adjutant. Charles was relieved. He had been worried that they had unwittingly taken in enemy spies. However, the risk of such a thing happening was too great, and so he decided that from that point on, they would treat the captives differently, taking their weapons and communication devices and locking them up until the war was over. Also, any paranormals who defected would be executed, as keeping them prisoner would be too risky. Therefore, any spies that did try to pretend they were defecting would be foiled, either locked up or executed. The closer they get to running out of food, the worse their morale will become, he said. If no one's betrayed them all day, and if they've killed so many of our captives, it must mean that they've either changed their commander, or that Leonard's changed his strategy. He turned to the captives. Did you see the enemy's face? He asked. The captives all shouted at once. We just saw someone trying to kill us. We didn't hang around to get a good look at them. That's right. We couldn't exactly worry about drawing a portrait of them when we were running for our lives. Arthur waved his hand to silence them. Whatever happened, we don't have many captives left now, he said. Take these people to the captive camp and keep them there until the war is over. The captives didn't move, even after the adjutant made the order. On the one hand, it could have been that they were so traumatized from the attack that it killed so many of them that they were frozen on the spot. But Charles was concerned that something else was going on. Wait a minute, he said. Let me check something. He walked toward the captives, who immediately started to panic. We only just escaped with our lives, one of them said. What do you expect from us now? Yeah, what do you want? Don't get any closer, mister. Charles grabbed one of the captives by the scruff of the neck. What are you hiding? He asked. We have rights, you know, called out another of them. You're bullying us. Yeah, said Charles, because for some reason you refused to budge. In an instant, he sensed what was about to happen and shoved the captive as far as he could in the direction of the others. And not a second too late, because just as Charles had managed to duck out of the way, the captive exploded. The explosion killed 20 or so of the captives, engulfing them in gleaming true fire. They rolled away screaming in pain. Arthur cried out, Charles, are you all right? He asked. I'm fine, said Charles, brushing dust from his clothes as he walked back to them. These people have been fitted with special bombs in their bodies, a combination of energy and explosives. They're powerful, but I detected them before they could do me any harm. He turned to the other surviving captives who were cowering in fear. I trust you won't have any objections if I inspect you, he asked. They shook their heads, speechless after the blast. No, sir. Go ahead. Whatever you say, sir. Charles sighed, disgusted by how pitiful the captives were. Then he approached them to carry out his inspection. Back at the military camp, Arthur and his adjutant tried to pacify the captive enemy soldiers, who were loudly protesting their most recent orders. We don't want to go. You're sending us to our deaths. Over 3,000 of us went out today and only 200 came back. You can't treat us like this. We haven't been properly fed in ages. Charles came to Arthur's side. What's going on? He asked. 3,000 of these captives went out to gather and trade resources, said the adjutant. We've raised all our prices, so they have to go out more often. In the end, only 180 returned. The others all died? Asked Charles, his heart sinking. I don't know, said the adjutant. But considering the state of Leonard's army, it's unlikely that any of them defected to him. It had become common knowledge that Leonard's army was quickly running out of supplies. Leonard himself had all but spelled it out when he had given the order to launch an all-out attack. However, rather than providing his soldiers with the boost they had needed to win the battle, his order had left their morale even more deteriorated. Countless of his soldiers had defected to Charles's side, trading their firearms for food. Of course, thanks to the tree ants in the energy storage space, Charles had no shortage of food, so he had agreed to their requests. Even though they didn't necessarily need the soldiers as firearms, he was pleased to have found another way to weaken Leonard's forces. And until that point, he hadn't cared much what the soldiers had done after trading in their weapons. A messenger arrived. "It isn't good news," he said. "We went out to find out what happened to the captives, and we were ambushed. We lost more than 500 people, more than 100 of them paranormals." Another messenger was right behind the first. "We've detected that parts of the ground are collapsing," he said. "We suspect someone is digging tunnels. It's likely that the enemy will try to attack from underground." Charles nodded. He knew that victory was hardly in his grasp, but had a feeling that he was about to face a familiar opponent. "Leonard must have killed all the people who went out to hunt," said Arthur, his expression solemn. "They seem to have changed their tactics. Has Leonard had some kind of brainwave, or do you think they've found another commander?" "Has anyone defected to us today?" Charles asked. "No one," said the adjutant. Charles was relieved. He had been worried that they had unwittingly taken in enemy spies. However, the risk of such a thing happening was too great, and so he decided that from that point on, they would treat the captives differently, taking their weapons and communication devices and locking them up until the war was over. Also, any paranormals who defected would be executed, as keeping them prisoner would be too risky. Therefore, any spies that did try to pretend they were defecting would be foiled, either locked up or executed. "And the closer they get to running out of food, the worse their morale will become," he said. "If no one's betrayed them all day, and if they've killed so many of our captives, it must mean that they've either changed their commander or that Leonard's changed his strategy." He turned to the captives. "Did you see the enemy's face?" he asked. The captives all shouted at once. "We just saw someone trying to kill us. We didn't hang around to get a good look at them." "That's right. We couldn't exactly worry about drawing a portrait of them when we were running for our lives." Arthur waved his hand to silence them. "Whatever happened, we don't have many captives left now," he said. "Take these people to the captive camp and keep them there until the war is over." The captives didn't move, even after the adjutant made the order. On the one hand, it could have been that they were so traumatized from the attack that had killed so many of them that they were frozen on the spot. But Charles was concerned that something else was going on. "Wait a minute," he said. "Let me check something." He walked toward the captives, who immediately started to panic. "We only just escaped with our lives," one of them said. "What do you expect from us now?" "Yeah, what do you want?" "Don't get any closer, mister." Charles grabbed one of the captives by the scruff of the neck. "What are you hiding?" he asked. "We have rights, you know," called out another of them. "You're bullying us." "Yeah," said Charles, "because for some reason you refused to budge." In an instant, he sensed what was about to happen and shoved the captive as far as he could in the direction of the others. And not a second too late, because just as Charles had managed to duck out of the way, the captive exploded. The explosion killed 20 or so of the captives, engulfing them in gleaming true fire. They rolled around, screaming in pain. Arthur cried out, "Charles, are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," said Charles, brushing dust from his clothes as he walked back to them. "These people have been fitted with special bombs in their bodies, a combination of energy and explosives. They're powerful, but I detected them before they could do me any harm." He turned to the other surviving captives, who were cowering in fear. "I trust you won't have any objections if I inspect you?" he asked. They shook their heads, speechless after the blast. "No, sir. Go ahead. Whatever you say, sir." Charles sighed, disgusted by how pitiful the captives were. Then he approached them to carry out his inspection. Charles's inspections of the other captives went smoothly enough. Having just watched one of their own group detonate before their eyes, everyone was eager to comply. Arthur watched Charles with some suspicion as he worked through each of the captives, encasing and iced the ones on whom he found explosives. "Okay," he said to the others. "You don't have to go back out there until the war ends. As long as you stay in your homes, you'll be fine. We'll give you regular food and even some playing cards, so you won't die of either hunger or boredom." The captives were very grateful. Since they had learned of how much danger they had just avoided, they regarded Charles with a great deal of gratitude. They couldn't spend too long thinking about the people who had died, especially as their deaths had secured them Charles's promise of a safe environment. In fact, some of them even felt the deaths were worth it for what they had gained. "What's wrong with these people?" Arthur asked, pointing to the captives trapped in the ice. Charles crossed to one of them and pulled a mass of death energy from their frozen body. "This is the work of the Death Legion," he said. "I don't know what it's used for, and I don't want to know. It'd waste valuable energy to investigate such trivial matters right now. But the Death Legion got to these people somehow and tried to use them to hurt us. Having shown that the captives have been infected by the Death Legion's energy, he executed them without hesitation. In time, he hoped to understand the true purpose of death energy, but he didn't have the resources for it at that moment. "I understand," said Arthur, who barely flinched when Charles killed the infected captives. He understood that he too would have no qualms about executing anybody who impeded the war effort, however innocent they may have been personally. "After tonight, the enemy will only have supplies to last them one more day, right?" asked Charles. "But maybe it's longer, especially now that their numbers are so much lower. We also can't ignore the possibility that they might have found a new source of food." Arthur's eyes widened, realizing he hadn't considered that. "I can't think of any other reason they would have killed all those captives, other than to keep their supplies going for longer," Charles continued. "Either way, we need to be ready to fight." Although he couldn't know for sure what the enemy army was up to, he had a strong sense that the real Leonard was in charge. But it didn't matter to Charles if he was up against Leonard or his twin brother. The important thing was that, whoever it was, he could tell it was his old nemesis. The enemy army attacked at daybreak. "The commander doesn't seem to have changed," said the adjutant, scanning the enemy's position through his telescope. "They're now being led by Amos Deacon. He was originally in charge of one of Leonard's divisions in Washington. I can't tell if he's really taken control or if it's some sort of ruse." He scratched his chin and thought. "Changing generals at the last minute before a battle is practically unheard of," he continued, "and they don't seem to be in the kind of panic I'd expect them to be in to be making that kind of move. But one thing's for sure, whoever's in control, they're coming for us, and as long as we defeat them, it doesn't matter who their leader is." The preceding battles had turned the nearby terrain to ruins, so the attacking army had no cover at all as it approached. To make up for that, the Death Legion's paranormals erected giant stone pillars from the ground, with ice and snow bridges extending to the city wall. They also created staircases leading up to the wall, making way for the Legion to launch its main attack. The Allied soldiers showered them with bullets, while the Allied paranormals desperately tried to destroy the bridges and staircases, while also using their superpowers to push back the attacking troops. At that point, the enemy's onslaught was much the same as what they had seen in the previous few days. Any time that more powerful enemies appeared, Charles and Lewis easily dealt with them. With the added assistance of the Black Lightning Dragon, Leonard's troops found it difficult to make any real advances. Even those who broke through the blockade line were unable to penetrate the wall of soldiers in dark iron armor on the other side. The only difference in the battle was that none of the enemy paranormals tried to attack the city wall itself. Rather, they kept up their advance, making use of the stone pillars and bridges. Anytime they were beaten back, they quickly retreated. "It's like they're deliberately consuming our energy," said Lewis, casually casting a storm strike at a level 5 paranormal. "Even if they don't break through our line, if they carry on like this, our paranormals will run out of energy." It had become a battle of attrition between the two sides as paranormals. Although the paranormals from the Washington army had a large amount of crystal cores to keep them fueled, Leonard's army had a greater number of paranormals overall. If they kept retreating before they could be killed, they would eventually end up with the advantage. "Don't worry," said Charles. "We just need to make sure the battle doesn't go on too long. Bring out all the paranormals in the Montreal army." "All right," said Lewis, and he went to call for the Montreal army. The soldiers were still in the secret area that Charles had taken them to, where only he and Lewis had permission to go in and out. Charles turned to Miranda. "I'm sorry," he said. "I wanted to fight a battle of attrition, but it's clear that plan won't work. We have to go all out." Miranda trembled, but then she took a deep breath to calm herself. Like Miranda, everyone on the battlefield had to simply accept the situation. Even Charles hadn't been able to decide when or how the battle would begin. But at that moment, he was in full swing, and he had to do everything in his power to win. "I understand," said Miranda in a flat tone. "Whatever you choose to do, I'll follow you." Not long after, Lewis led more than 600 paranormals from the Montreal army into the battle, pushing back Leonard's forces. After 2 hours of frantic fighting, though, there had still been fewer than 30 casualties on both sides. The Montreal paranormals ran out of breath, even with the help of crystal cores.
Although they could still fight, they were near their limits. Of course, many of Leonard's forces were also in a bad way. Many of his paranormals had run out of soul energy, and they didn't have sufficient crystal cores to replenish themselves. It didn't help that they were up against a large number of hellhounds. Although the hounds that Charles had summoned were limited in their strength in the mortal world, each of them effectively played the role of a true hellfire flamethrower. Against that formidable force, the fact that Leonard's troops were able to remain in the fight at all was a true testament to their strength. "Are we preparing for the final push?" asked Arthur. He and the adjutant looked incredibly concerned, not quite sure what the next strategy would look like, but understanding that it would be the only option once their paranormals had used up their soul energy. But at that moment, the enemy's army pulled back completely. "Now it's time for the counterattack," Charles said. The others looked at him confused. "This attack has been just a meaningless battle of attrition," he continued. "They've been acting like they have some extra force behind them, when they don't. Now they're retreating to save their skins. There can't be more than 8,000 troops left in their camp." "How can you be so sure of their movements?" asked the adjutant. "And if you knew this all along, why didn't you act accordingly?" He finally realized just how well Charles understood the enemy's movements, and that explained how he had known exactly where to attack the enemy in previous battles. However, he couldn't understand why Charles had still allowed the enemy to attack when he must have known how they were going to do so. "I believe in Charles," said Arthur. "He must have had a reason." Then he turned to Charles. "What do we do next?" he asked. "After the recent fighting, we still have 22,000 troops left," said Charles. "I'll take the Montreal soldiers away and leave the rest to you. With our combined forces, it'll only be a matter of time before we defeat the enemy. I'll also summon some more hellhounds to help. With them at our side, I'll take the Montreal soldiers after the enemy." "You'll only take the 6,000 from Montreal?" asked Arthur. "I'm not doubting your power, but they've already retreated. Where's the sense in chasing after them?" "If you really trust me, now's the time to show it," said Charles. "We can't afford to be complacent, even with the enemy on the back foot." He called to Lewis. "Get everyone ready to leave." On his way to gather the Montreal troops, he passed Harper. "Watch closely," he said to her, "and I'll show you the consequences of leaving your back exposed to the enemy." He wasn't mocking her, but teaching her. If she really was going to learn the ins and outs of warfare, she would need to understand how things worked not only in small skirmishes, but large-scale battles. The Montreal troops organized themselves efficiently and began to set off. "I'll leave the rest to you. Take care," Charles said to Arthur, and the two shook hands. For a moment their eyes met. Arthur nodded, but was too choked up to say anything. The Montreal army had its own vehicles. Although the ice and snow made it difficult to travel, they sent fire-powered paranormals ahead of them to clear the way. With those arrangements, they moved very fast and soon caught up with the enemy army. To Charles, the sight of them was like a warming fire after days of cold. "If I remember correctly, the area ahead of us is War Zone 6, he said to Lewis. "Is that right?" Lewis nodded. "General Alan Ray is in charge there," he said. "Leonard's troops tried crossing the area for more supplies, but General Ray intercepted them. He promised that he'd die on the battlefield before he let an enemy soldier pass through." He called the chief of staff to his side. "Pass on a warning," he said. "Tell the general to protect our soldiers, but not to overextend himself. This next battle might be more dangerous than expected." "Yes, sir," said the chief of staff. 5 minutes later, Charles suddenly raised his hand to halt the convoy. "The enemy knows we're on their tail," he said. "They've set an ambush up ahead." "What should we do?" asked Lewis, steeling himself for a fight. "Take care of yourself," said Charles. "Don't act rashly. Tina, Hugh, Tommy, and Miranda, come with me." When they'd arrived at his side, he said, "We're the Knights of Hell, right? Time to show them how we earned that name. Knights of Hell, take out the weapons I gave you and bring despair upon your enemies," Charles said. The knights pulled their swords from their waists in unison. In addition to being 3 feet long, the weapons were metallic red in color. They looked like bloody moon crescents, but upon closer inspection, one could see they were radiating a faint purple light. Most of the curved blades were made of crimson flame energy gems, but a small amount of blue flame energy was present in them as well. The Dark Dwarves were experts at forging equipment, but they were only craftsmen. A true refiner was proficient in the creation of weapons, as well as the excavation of mines to obtain resources. Though Charles had only been an assistant in the refining process, the dwarves had been able to acquire advanced knowledge as a result, resulting in the deadly weapons the knights held. "Let's go," Charles said, taking the lead. The Knights of Hell followed him. At that point, they hadn't seen the enemy nor entered their line of sight. However, since Charles had said that the enemy was right in front of them, they raced forward without hesitation. The Knights of Hell wore dark iron armor, giving them the appearance of a wave of steel plowing through the snow. Charles released some storm and frost extract amulets. A gust of wind blew in front of them, exposing all the enemies that were hiding in the snow up ahead. Even before the ambushers could react, the Knights of Hell had already rushed in front of them. They wielded their blood-red swords as they quickly passed through the enemy's camp, mowing the enemy down. Wherever they went, they left a trail of death and destruction. Although the Knights' two-horned horse mounts weren't as fast as the Nightmare horses, they were still 3rd and 4th level beasts that could survive the depths of hell. Their average speed could reach 100 miles per hour, and when they hit a full sprint, it was double that. Against such supernatural speed, ordinary people had no chance to defend themselves. Even a level 4 paranormal would be considered lucky to escape with their life. As the cavalry blazed through the attacking troops, their speed was as fast as lightning, and their red scimitars sliced through the air. Any enemy standing in their way was quickly dealt with. The snow glowed with black light and was stained red with the blood of their foes. Tina, Tommy, and the others rushed to the side of the battle but didn't attack. They just stood back and watched as the knights sliced through the enemy, ready to step in if needed. After the first round, half of the 1,000 enemy soldiers who had been lying in wait were dead in the blink of an eye. The other half looked as if they were still in shock. However, before they could recover, the Knights of Hell turned around and prepared to make another pass. The enemy forces cried out in terror. "Oh no, here they come again! Everybody get down!" Following Charles's order, the Knights of Hell charged into the fray with magnificent speed. Charles was at the front, responsible for killing the strongest enemies, while Miranda was at the back, killing the stragglers who managed to survive the charge. Some people who thought themselves clever chose to lie in the snow and pretend to be dead, hoping they could escape the massacre. The Knights of Hell chose to let them go. If they wanted to kill them, they would have to go through and stab all the corpses lying on the ground, which would be a time-consuming task with little benefit. When the second charge ended, Charles didn't make things too difficult for the enemy soldiers pretending to be dead. He knew they would make it back to camp and tell their comrades of the terrors they had witnessed, poisoning the enemy's ranks from the inside out. Through the communication token, he ordered, "Zach, Lewis, send 200 men to clean up the battlefield. The rest of the men should be ready to leave in 5 minutes." After giving the order, Charles glanced at the knights' faces, which were flushed red with excitement. Charles had kept them out of sight for the previous few battles, so they hadn't had a chance to fight on the battlefield. During that time, their daily training had been indispensable, but it wasn't until they had a chance to use their new weapons that they understood the purpose of their training. All of their previous training was for this battle. It's time to recruit some knight retainers, Charles thought. He knew he couldn't hand over the task of cleaning up the battlefield to the regular cavalry. However, he couldn't pass down an order every time he needed to clean up the battlefield either. That was why he had planned on recruiting more knights and retainers. The problem was, he didn't have enough mounts for any additional knights, and he would have to take a significant risk to find more. After Miranda killed more than 10 people who had tried to stand up, none of the remaining people dared to move, so she came and stood by Charles's side. At that moment, she understood why the creation of a cavalry in the cold weapons era was so important. Before Zach, Lewis, and the others could come over, Charles spoke to the knights. "Today is a great day to claim your fame in this world. This is just the beginning." Then he pointed his sword and shouted, "Knights of Hell, charge!" The knights let out excited roars that sounded like wild beasts. They couldn't see the enemy, but they saw where Charles's sword was pointing. They set off once again, rushing forward. When the knights caught up to the enemy again, many of them had their backs facing them. The oblivious soldiers only turned around when they heard the sound of horses behind them, and by then, it was too late. A dazzling red light illuminated the black snow as blood splashed everywhere. Then the screams of the slaughtered rang out. When the Knights of Hell ambushed Leonard's forces, they flew into a panic. The soldiers had been retreating from battle, and the knights had suddenly appeared behind them without warning. The knights' red scimitars were like burning hot irons. They cut through flesh with laser-like focus, without slowing down for even a second, decimating the enemy's formation. Wherever they went, hell followed. The density of the crowd allowed the knights to reap more than 1,000 casualties in a very short period of time. The surviving enemy forces scrambled around, trying to figure out what was going on. "What kind of soldiers are they?" one paranormal cried. "Is that a cavalry unit?" another asked. The Knights of Hell quickly cut through the enemy's camp. 500 yards away, they turned their horses around and prepared for the next charge. But by that time, the Death Legion soldiers and the other soldiers began to react. Countless paranormals poured onto the battlefield. Storm, ice, fire, earth, and thorns bombarded the knights, but a golden light appeared on their bodies. It served as a barrier, protecting the knights and their horses. "Charge!" Charles ordered again. Under his leadership, the knights fearlessly charged the enemy. With a terrifying speed of more than 100 miles per hour, most of the enemy's superpowers were useless. Only wide area of effect spells made any contact. However, the power of such spells was always inversely proportional to their range, and those few spells were captured by Charles's preservation ability. Then, a few fire dragons and ice dragons danced in the air, dispelling the spells. They burst into dazzling fireworks in the air. Some paranormals focused on breaking through the golden light protecting the knights, but their attacks dissipated like a gentle breeze and disappeared without a trace. Impossible! Are they monsters? What exactly is that golden light on their bodies? When they realized that their powers were ineffective against the knights, the members of Leonard's army began to panic. Apart from the Death Legion soldiers, who were still able to maintain their calm, the rest of the soldiers were desperately thinking of ways to escape. Some of them had even started burrowing into the snow. Looping back around with another charge, the knights arrived once again. Although the enemy soldiers had anticipated the next attack, their hasty preparations didn't have much of an effect against it. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't stop the knights' curved blades. Leonard's army was in chaos. No one was listening to the leaders, and everyone was running around like a chicken with its head cut off. Even the Death Legion was no match for the Knights of Hell. In such a deadly ambush, even a powerful level 5 paranormal would find it difficult to stop the terrifying army of knights in dark iron armor. Some fearless Death Legion elites tried their best to block the knights' path, but they were at their wits' end when faced with a golden light that protected them. The weaker soldiers didn't have the skills or experience to harm the golden barrier. The true defensive power of the golden light was attached to the surface of the knights' bodies. On top of that, they had dark iron armor, which the majority of attacks dealt nearly zero damage to. Only those who could break through the armor and had spellcasting capabilities could damage the golden light barrier. With another order to charge, the Knights of Hell tore through the crowd again, reaping lives without mercy. Blood sprayed the air once again. None of the enemies that blocked their path could withstand a single attack from them, and there were more than 400 casualties. 2 of the knights had been pulled down from their horses by the enemy, but Tina and Miranda had saved them. Charles had brought them along to reduce the number of casualties. The battle continued, and Charles had no intention of stopping. "Knights of Hell, turn around and charge again," he said. After a few seconds of rest, the vast and mighty knights swiftly began their next charge, cutting through the scattered troops once again. After the third charge ended, the enemy had lost a third of their troops. However, the Knights of Hell weren't finished. "Knights of Hell, charge!" When they heard yet another order to charge, all of the enemy soldiers trembled. Their courage evaporated, causing them to collapse. "Run!" a soldier cried. "We're no match for these monsters. We need to catch up to the rest of the army if we want to have a prayer of surviving this." The soldiers frantically tossed aside their weapons and equipment, as well as some supplies that they carried with them, because they would hinder their escape. Under the order of their commander, the members of the Death Legion began to retreat too. The Shaws didn't want to waste such valuable troops on such a hopeless battle. Charles was well aware that in ancient battlefields, most of the casualties hadn't been caused in frontal battles, but in the process of pursuit. Knowing this, He ordered the Knights of Hell to chase after the fleeing soldiers, and they harvested the soldiers' souls as they ran for their lives. Behind them, the elite division from Montreal was responsible for cleaning up the battlefield and killing any stragglers. Because they were all familiar with the battlefield, there were no deaths or ambushes. Harper stood among the elites and scanned the battlefield. When she saw the hellish scene that had unfolded, she finally understood how stupid her previous decision had been. If it had been a small battle, her plan might have been feasible. But facing an entire legion, it would have been suicide. The golden light Charles had added to the bodies of the Knights of Hell was created by light amulets. The most important function of this type of amulet was defense. However, they weren't very effective against physical attacks. They were mainly used to defend against magic attacks. Fortunately, the Knights also wore dark iron armor, and with the added protection of their soul energy, their physical defense was already very high. Moreover, the dark iron armor on their bodies had been forged by Charles, and he'd increased the strength of the materials, holding the armor together even further using his abilities. Under a defense that was even sturdier than a tortoise shell, there was no need for them to worry about incoming damage from the enemy. Moreover, once they moved at such high speed, not many people could hit them. In addition to the terrifying curved blades they wielded, the Knights displayed a terrifying determination. They were like a cloud of locusts clearing the battlefield. Unfortunately, there were too few of them. When they had departed from Dawn City, there had been a total of 120 members. 2 of them had died on the way, and then 6 of them had been killed in a previous battle. Even if each of the remaining knights could take out 5 lives with a single swipe of their sword, they could only kill about 500 enemies. They relied on their terrifying speed and combat power instead of strength in numbers to successfully fell their enemies. However, Charles didn't care about this. Regardless of their numbers, the enemy was running scared, and even the seemingly fearless Death Legion soldiers knew that they were in danger. Only by preserving part of their human instincts were they able to muster their combat strength under the influence of the death energy. And those same instincts told them that they were outmatched. Charles had created an astonishing scene where the Knights of Hell, with a little more than 100 people, were chasing away an army of over 1,000 people. "Show no mercy," he shouted. The Knights were brimming with killing intent. In the past, they had typically fought against zombies, and they soon realized humans were considerably weaker foes. Of the 3,000 deserters who had fled the battlefield and rejoined the main force, only 200 had survived. The rest had either been killed by the Knights or lost in the snow. What once had been considered an unmatched fight had turned into a one-sided slaughter with the Knights of Hell as the victors. The remaining survivors were left with an indelible mark on their souls as they faced the black armored cavalry. They saw the Knights as ministers of death who'd come to drag them into hell. When the fleeing army caught up to the main force, chaos rippled through the ranks. "What's going on?" one senior officer asked the deserters. "How could they have caught up so quickly?" "How many people are chasing them?" another said. "What? There's barely 100 people," a third said in shock. 3,000 soldiers were beaten by a small cavalry? The leaders of the main force were furious. They hadn't expected their army to be chased away by a mere 100 people. The thought occurred to them that their enemy might have had divine weapons at their disposal. A general started barking orders. "No matter what, prepare for defense first. Get into formation. Paranormals, raise the shields." The soldiers knew it wasn't the time to cast blame. Their most important task was to defend their position. The paranormals obeyed and started using their superpowers. Pillars of earth rose from the ground, and ice and snow formed a wall between them that served as a makeshift defense. Although it was just a simple wall, it would stop the Knights of Hell from slaughtering the rest of the army. The Knights chased them to within a few feet of the wall, and then they stopped under Charles's signal. Mark's eyes glowed red with bloodlust. "Are we going to break through the wall?" he asked Charles excitedly. Charles held up his hand to restrain him. It'd be a waste to break through. There are only 20,000 men in the main force, with 10,000 in the Death Legion. There are still 16,000 in front of us. There are a lot of people present, but they aren't the enemy's main forces. On top of that, Leonard isn't here. Ever since the captives who had gone out hunting zombies had suffered heavy losses, Charles had been bewildered by Leonard's actions and unable to see through his plans anymore. Leonard had actually abandoned the battlefield in the main city, turning his back on his enemy in war. This was an act of suicide. After pondering the situation for a while, Charles handed a token to Hugh and said, "Go back and tell Lewis not to worry about the camp. Just go around it. This is a separate sensing token. You can sense the location of the other token. Where the other token stops giving off its signal, that's where you will set up camp. After you set it up, return to me." Hugh gave a proud salute and shouted, "Yes, sir!" He showed no contempt for being sent on an errand. After he left, Charles turned to the Knights of Hell and said, "Follow me. Keep moving forward at full speed." The two-horned horses had only used less than a tenth of their strength, and the knights were just getting warmed up. They all disappeared in the snow under Charles's lead. "What exactly are they trying to do?" an enemy general asked as he watched the knights in confusion. "No matter what they're planning next, we still have to take care of our defense." They not only needed to strengthen the wall, but they also had to guard against the knights from all directions and prevent them from attacking. But the general hadn't anticipated that Charles would give up on attacking their base. As the snow continued to fall, the 20,000 soldiers hiding behind the wall just stood there, their hearts pounding as they waited to see what the knights would do next. In Warzone 6, a messenger dashed up to a middle-aged man. "Reporting to General Ray," he said, saluting. "The enemy has left the fort. The target is approaching." "They've been defending that line for the past few days, and now they've decided to come out?" General Alan Ray said more to himself than the messenger. "They must have run out of supplies. Now's our chance." The general maintained a stoic expression. "Their commander is Oscar Shaw, one of the military geniuses of the Shaw family. There was a time 10 years ago when he and Owen were heroes. Don't be foolish and think that I'm exaggerating when I say we need to be extremely careful when facing a general of his caliber." Then he revealed a look of pity. "The Shaw family raised generations of talented heroes to protect their country," he thought. "I never thought that they'd turn out like this. Can power really corrode people's hearts like that? Or are the lives of their people simply tools for war?" The Shaws were a famous family of generals in Washington, D.C., who had raised up numerous heroes. Some people felt that the privileges the family enjoyed were unfair. But what family wouldn't take some liberties if they had the power to do so? The general assumption was that the world was unfair. However, the truth was that the world was so objective that it made people's hearts grow cold since it only rewarded those who succeeded. There were few second chances, and no grace. Nevertheless, the Shaws had roused the anger of the entire city. No one knew why the family had turned on the country. However, their actions had been a betrayal to the United States, and they had acted against the interests of the human race. They had wantonly slaughtered civilians, and even attacked soldiers who were protecting the country. No matter the reason, their actions were unforgivable. 10 minutes after the messenger had passed down the order, the enemy army had arrived in their field of vision, reaching a range where they could exchange fire. The enemy had exchanged fire with them multiple times, trying to transport supplies to the city center, but they had never succeeded. None of their troops had been able to get through the blockade. After the enemy entered the range of the fire, machine guns began spewing a stream of bullets at them. Under Oscar's command, the Shaw army braved the assault and charged toward the fortress, but they were repelled twice in a row. Allen was also a distinguished man of war. In terms of military strength and equipment, he had more than twice what the enemy had, giving his troops a significant advantage in battle. After the enemy lost more than 2,000 soldiers, they retreated and reorganized their formation. Allen looked at the broken bodies below the wall. "These are our countrymen," he cried out, "sacrificed to the whims of a power-hungry narcissist." He couldn't hide the sadness in his eyes, but in the end, he held back his tears, shaking his head. The soldiers who had been enlisted to protect the country had become sacrifices for greedy men. But even though he felt sorry for them, he had to continue to fight because he couldn't let the Shaws take over the country. After taking a few minutes to rest, the enemy launched another attack. Fire. With Allen's order, the battle started again. At that moment, A messenger ran up to him. "General," he said, panting. "It's not good. We've lost contact with the sentry post that was supposed to be guarding the rear." Alan's pupils shrank. "What do you mean?" he shouted. He had thought that the defensive line he had set up was free of blind spots. Even if the enemy took out all the sentry posts, if Alan and his men didn't receive a status report every few minutes, they would know something was up. But the enemy had an army ready to attack them from the rear. "Send out the scouts," Alan ordered. "Find out what the hell is going on." 15 minutes later, he received more bad news. "We lost half of the scouts. The enemy has 16,000 soldiers in total and is attacking us from 3 different directions. I'm afraid it looks like they're using Oscar's army in a pincer attack." 16,000 men. Alan's voice trailed off. At the same time, he received another report from Arthur. He took a deep breath and said, "Get ready to fight. Our reinforcements are almost here." 5 minutes later, an army with a troublesome aura appeared. A man in white armor stood in front of the army and shouted at Alan's line of defense. "General Ray, you're surrounded. I'll give you a chance to surrender and die with dignity. Otherwise, don't blame me for being merciless." Although Leonard wore a calm expression, anger rose in his heart. Initially, he had thought this was a surprise attack. He hadn't realized that the Allied army had come prepared. "Charles, is this your doing?" he wondered, his stomach churning with rage. Although he had no proof that Charles was behind everything, Leonard felt the strong will of Charles's invisible hand guiding the Allied soldiers' every move. He knew deep down that his attempt at an ambush had been foiled by Charles's preparations yet again. Alan stood on the wall. "Leonard, I attended your awards ceremony," he said coldly. "I never expected you to be reduced to this. Stop this foolishness. If you surrender now, your men will have a chance to serve their country with honor. Otherwise, you'll drag everyone who follows you down to their deaths." Leonard laughed and said, "I never expected you to be such a stubborn old man. Power is the only honorable thing left in this world. I can do whatever I want. Your so-called convictions and honor are worthless if you don't have the power to defend them. Your army will fall, and I'll rule the country. I am the savior of this world, and my name will live on in infamy. But you, with your self-righteous prattling, will die, and your name will live on only in shame and defeat." Alan was taken aback by Leonard's biting words. "He's drunk off power," he thought. "He's become insane with his quest for glory. It's clear he can't be reasoned with. The time for talking is over." "Well, if that's how you feel," he said, "then there's nothing else to talk about." Then he turned to his troops and gave the order. "Fire!" A determined look flashed across Leonard's eyes. "I'll crush every last one of you to bone meal. Charge!" On his order, the Death Legion attacked the fortress. The machine guns along the top of the wall opened fire, but the bullets hit the protective energy barrier of the Death Legion and bounced off. The enemy paranormals unleashed a large number of spells from behind the barrier. Their concerted efforts and powerful attacks caused the wall to crumble to ruins. Leonard's eyes flashed with delight as the battle of his dreams finally played out in front of him. "Kill them all!" he screamed. The soldiers beside him charged forward. Under the formidable power of the Death Legion, the Allied army was unable to hold its position any longer, and the front line began to break. A few of Alan's personal guards came to his side and said, "Please go to the rear line of defense, General Ray. If something happens to you, it'll shake the soldiers' morale." Alan was reluctant, but he agreed, understanding that his death would devastate the soldiers and shake their courage. As the general's guards covered his retreat, Leonard raised his white spear and stabbed a level 5 paranormal. Blood sprayed all over his face, making him look like a madman as he laughed maniacally. The paranormal died with a look of determination on his face. He had one more surprise up his sleeve. Suddenly, white-hot flames exploded in all directions, surrounding Leonard and the soldiers around him. Leonard emerged from the smoke, looking fiercer than ever. "Why?" he said, gritting his teeth. "Why do they think they can stop me? Why won't they just obey? Why do they insist on pestering me even though they know they're going to die? The battle between the Shaw army and the Allied army raged on. Almost every member of the Death Legion had the strength of a peak level 4 paranormal, and there were even some level 5s among them. Outmatched and outnumbered, the Allied army suffered heavy casualties. When the Allied soldiers saw the difference in strength between the two sides, they simply gave up all their defenses and took an all-out offensive stance. "Give them hell! Don't hold back!" one Allied soldier cried. "Even if we die, we're going to take down as many as we can," another shouted. One Allied soldier used all his strength to slash at the abdomen of a Death Legion soldier. The blow wasn't fatal, so he tried again, but was blocked and instantly killed. The Death Legion soldier lowered his head and looked at the wound. He found it hard to believe that his enemy had even managed to land a blow, let alone cause damage. At that moment, two more Allied soldiers rushed toward him, weapons raised. Before he could react, they were on top of him, mercilessly slashing away. He spat out a mouthful of blood as his energy drained from his body, and he fell to the ground. Leonard kept waving the long spear in his hand, and one after another, the Allied paranormals fell dead at his feet. He was about to move forward, but a half-dead soldier held onto his leg. One soldier jumped him, while another swung his sword, missing his throat by inches. Enraged, Leonard unleashed a blinding white light that sent everyone flying. He cursed under his breath, thinking, "Why do they keep fighting?" With the flick of his spear, he slaughtered another handful of soldiers. "They're like a swarm of gnats," he thought. "They can't stop me, but they refuse to surrender. It's almost as if they want to die." He had thought they would lay down their weapons when they realized they were outmatched, but they kept coming. He started to wonder if absolute power wasn't enough to stop them. Even though Leonard's army had destroyed a quarter of the fortress wall, under the vicious and relentless counterattack of the Allied soldiers, the Death Legion's casualties started to pile up. In just under an hour, he had lost more than 3,000 of his most valuable soldiers, which forced him to give up his assault. Around the rest of the fort, the battered and bruised Allied soldiers began reorganizing. The enemy had been closing in on them from all sides, slowly wearing down their resolve. They had already lost more than 20,000 people, and most of the remaining soldiers had taken a severe beating. If the battle continued, no one knew how much longer they could hold out. Allen stood up among the soldiers and began to speak. "My fellow Americans, we have always believed that justice will prevail over evil. Our ancestors faced countless hardships and threats of extinction, but they won every time. We come from a race of victors. We will win this fight. Now, there are some ambitious people who want to overthrow our nation, but we will never surrender to the tyranny of the enemy. We will never surrender to evil. Brave soldiers, we have to rise up and defend our liberty for the sake of our loved ones." The troops let out a ground-shaking battle cry. Their fire for battle had been reignited. The fate of their whole country was on the line, and they had no intentions of laying down for the enemy. "We will fight to the last soldier," an officer shouted. "So long as there is blood in our veins, we will fight. We will never give up." As if on cue, the Knights of Hell appeared like angels of death rising out of the snow. Both the Allied army and Leonard's army were exhausted after exerting so much strength on the battlefield, so they took a brief rest. The Allied soldiers who had been caught in the pincer attack were especially drained, and it took all their willpower just to stay upright. They were grateful for the momentary reprieve, but the enemy had only paused because of the great number of casualties they had suffered. Just as the next round of conflict was about to begin, the Knights of Hell appeared on the ruined battlefield like a black arrow piercing through the snow. "Knights of Hell, charge!" Charles cried. "Kill them all." Their appearance surprised everyone. When Leonard saw the cavalry surging forward, his pupils shrank. "What are they doing here?" he murmured in horror. He had thought his plan was perfect and would buy him some time at the very least, but he hadn't expected his enemy to arrive so quickly. "But what can such a small group really accomplish?" he scoffed. He scowled in Charles's direction. "Since these people are so eager to die, we'll just have to fulfill their wishes." The knights rushed with frightening speed toward the Death Legion, who prepared themselves for battle. Inside the fortress, Allen cursed. "There's so few of them," he exclaimed. "They're going to throw away their lives for nothing." He was surprised and impressed by how fast the group of reinforcements charged forward, but he wondered how only 100 people could really make a difference. Even so, since reinforcements had arrived, he had no choice but to have his people join them. If they didn't, they would look like cowards. "Soldiers, prepare for battle," Allen ordered. The knights only took a handful of seconds to arrive in front of the enemy. The Death Legion had organized the best defense they could in such a short time. It wasn't great, but it would have to be enough. The group of 100 knights charged into the formation of more than 10,000 enemy soldiers, while the Allied soldiers watched in shock, thinking that the knights had lost their minds. Just as the two sides were about to meet, the massive Black Lightning Dragon appeared in the sky and spat a black lightning bolt toward the Death Legion. Screams filled the air. Over 100 Death Legion soldiers on the front line fell to the ground, twitching. The people behind them were caught off guard as the Knights of Hell arrived with blinding speed, holding red scimitars that cast dazzling red light onto the snow. Their weapons could cut through anything. Charles rode up on his nightmare horse and rushed to the front of the Knights' formation. He held a silver spear in his right hand and the Hell Sword in his left as he dashed toward Leonard. He narrowed his eyes and said, "Let's see if you're the real Leonard." He used his sword to cut down all the enemy soldiers in his path as Bullet galloped too fast for anyone to stop him, and he killed dozens of people on his way to Leonard. "Protect the general!" someone shouted. Hundreds of soldiers surrounded Leonard, ready to defend him, but each of them screamed in misery as Charles killed them. And behind him, the knights still charged forward, cutting through all their enemies. The Death Legion soldiers fell like wheat being harvested. No one could survive in the path of the Knights of Hell. "No, he's come for me again," Leonard thought, his eyes widening in fear. The last time he had faced Charles, he had almost died. Now Charles was back to finish the job, and he seemed to be sufficiently prepared this time. Leonard's only thought was of escaping from Charles and the ferocious Knights of Hell. "I can't die. I have to get out of here," he thought. The Black Lightning Dragon danced in the sky, shooting its black lightning at one enemy after another and protecting the knights. Dozens of gray hellhounds appeared on both sides of the group of knights. That was as many as Charles had been able to summon, but they were the greatest protection he could offer. "Knights of Hell, charge!" Charles ordered. They charged across the battlefield, killing their way through until there were no enemies left in front of them. Leonard had already retreated and had sought protection on the other side of the Death Legion. "Turn around and charge again," Charles called. The knights, who had eliminated all the enemies on that side, immediately turned their horses around and charged toward the Death Legion once again. They were like scythes, reaping the lives of their enemies. Allen seized the opportunity and ordered his soldiers to join the fray. "Get in there with them," he yelled. "Don't let our friends fight alone." The soldiers under his command looked eager to fight, inspired by the heroic bearing of the knights. They forgot all thoughts of how powerful the enemy seemed. The Death Legion's formation had been splintered, and they were trying to regroup, but they were thrown into chaos when the knights charged through their forces once again. The steeds the knights rode on seemed to have hooves made of iron that could break through any obstacle. They were unstoppable. A few adjutants rushed to Leonard's side with tears in their eyes and tried to persuade him to flee. "Call for a retreat, General," one of them begged. "We can't let the Death Legion continue to suffer casualties." The Death Legion had been their greatest hope, and they were being cut down faster than anyone could fathom. The adjutants wondered if they had been right to place all their hopes on such an army. Leonard trembled. Charles had blocked all his moves and had ruined his plan again. He had thought he had made progress, but standing in front of Charles, he had lost the courage to fight. "Retreat!" Leonard called. The Death Legion began to retreat like a tide, but as they did, Oscar's army suddenly cut between them and the pursuing Allied soldiers. With a determined expression, Oscar turned and shouted at Leonard, "Hurry up and get out of here! We'll cover you! Don't let me down!" As he spoke, a large number of soldiers blocked both the Allied soldiers and the Knights of Hell from reaching the Death Legion. The knights waved their red scimitars and killed countless soldiers. Dazzling red light danced all over the battlefield, but the Shaw army didn't retreat. "No, how could this happen?" Leonard wailed. Not again! He was filled with grief and indignation as he thought about when his Uncle Owen had helped cover his retreat and had sacrificed himself. He realized the same situation was happening again with his other uncle, Oscar. But since his army had lost the advantage, he had no choice but to retreat until they could reorganize themselves. "Retreat!" Leonard ordered. His eyes were bloodshot. Charles saw Leonard's panic, and it made him confused and angry. "This coward definitely isn't the real Leonard," he muttered. He cast his gaze at Oscar. Although he didn't know who Oscar was, he knew he had to be someone very important to Leonard. Otherwise, a cold-hearted person like Leonard wouldn't have let out such a sorrowful roar at the idea of losing him. Charles rolled his eyes. Why are so many people willing to protect this scumbag? He walked over to Miranda and said, "Help me clear this formation of soldiers. I'll deal with the leader, and then I'll need your help later." He urged Bullet forward, and the horse glowed with purple light as it shot toward Oscar like a bolt of lightning. A few powerful paranormals blocked Charles's path, but before they could get too close to him, he killed them with the terrifying power of his innate sword energy. One after another they fell, and the distance between Charles and Oscar quickly dwindled. "Not good," Oscar said. "He's going to kill me. Stop him!" Many more paranormals blocked Charles's path, but before they could attack, a dozen fire dragons and a dozen ice dragons appeared in front of Charles, glowing red. "How is this possible?" the paranormals murmured to each other. They had never thought anyone could summon so many dragons so quickly, but it was too late for them to react. The ice dragons and fire dragons collided and sent the paranormals flying, turning them and everyone around them into either dust or ice. Oscar knew he had to react quickly to Charles's aggressive approach. He poured a large amount of white soul energy into the spear in his hand. Then he abandoned his defenses, gathered all his power into his spear, and thrust it at Charles. He had seen Charles chasing after Leonard earlier. Almost instantly, he had identified Charles as the terrifying person from the intelligence report he had received. Oscar had given up trying to defend himself because he knew that if Charles was really as powerful as the intelligence report suggested, then there was absolutely no chance that he would survive the encounter. Gleaming with extremely condensed light, the spear whizzed through the air toward Charles. It seemed sharp enough to pierce through anything. "Go to hell!" Oscar yelled. His eyes were filled with resolve. He didn't know if his move would succeed, but he thought that at the very least, he could severely injure this terrifying young man and clear a path for Leonard. But then he saw that the weapon that had been in Charles's hand had disappeared. Before he could react, Charles had already arrived in front of him. He gripped the spear in one hand and Oscar's throat in the other. "He wants to capture me." Oscar strained to call out as Charles's grip on his throat tightened. He hadn't expected a young man like Charles to be so bold as to capture an enemy general rather than kill him. "I won't let you get away with it," Oscar promised. The soul energy in his body burst out in a flash of dazzling white light, but then it quickly started to dim. "Kill me! Kill me!" Oscar shouted anxiously to his soldiers. He would rather die than be captured, but his shouts quickly subsided. Invisible soul energy surged into his body and paralyzed his limbs. His voice weakened, and he soon lost consciousness. Charles laid his hand on Oscar's shoulder, and a strong golden light surrounded the man's body. "Miranda, catch," Charles called. He tossed Oscar to Miranda, who caught him and quickly turned and headed for the camp. A group of his soldiers surrounded her, trying their best to rescue their general. "Save the general! Get him back!" The black lightning dragon spat out another ball of lightning at the soldiers, and they all fell to the ground, jerking. The Knights of Hell took the opportunity to charge in their direction, trampling their enemies along the way. Oscar's soldiers wanted to save him, but they didn't stand a chance against the Knights of Hell. Even if they had been able to reach him, they wouldn't have been able to break through the golden light shield Charles had put around him. Miranda placed Oscar in front of her on her horse and easily killed a few nearby enemy soldiers. With the help of Tina, Tommy, and Hugh, she quickly retreated to the camp. Once Miranda had taken Oscar safely away from the battlefield, Charles relaxed. He led the Knights of Hell around the bulk of the remaining enemy soldiers, and then they retreated in the same direction Miranda had gone, killing anyone blocking their way. The soldiers and paranormals of Oscar's army chased after them desperately, still trying to rescue their general. Charles saw them pursuing and admired their courage. If only they could use their bravery for good, he said with a sigh. Then he threw out dozens of red flame beads that exploded in a series of bangs, and true fire burned everything behind them. The Black Lightning Dragon continued to breathe black lightning, turning everything left into dust, while Charles and all his forces retreated to the camp. "Uncle Oscar!" Leonard called. His eyes were red with tears. Owen had once helped cover his retreat and had died. Oscar had just done the same and had fallen into Charles's hands. Leonard's two uncles had been heroes and the pride of the Shaw family, and they had both sacrificed themselves on the battlefield for his sake. But there was nothing he could do about it. He was strong, but he felt powerless compared to Charles. He's a monster, Leonard thought. No matter what, I have to kill him. He turned away from the battlefield, seething with seemingly endless hatred. Meanwhile, Alan ordered the Allied army to retreat. His troops had fought valiantly and had killed all the enemy soldiers who had come to cover Leonard's retreat. But after the enemy had left, there was nothing more for them to do. Once the entire Allied army heard the order to withdraw, countless soldiers collapsed to the ground in exhaustion. They had reached their limits. For some of them, their willpower had been the only thing keeping them on their feet, and they could no longer support themselves. Charles approached Oscar, who was tied to a chair made of dark iron. He casually pulled over a chair and sat down in front of him. "So, Oscar," he said, "I hear you're quite the hero. You and your brother Owen are the Shaw family's pride and joy. You made a name for yourself in the war against terrorism, and you've actively defended your country." He narrowed his eyes. "I'm very curious why someone like you would be prepared to die for a coward like Leonard. Is the Shaw family so desperate that they're counting on that piece of scum to save their cause?" Oscar was covered in wounds. He raised his head, looked at Charles for a long moment, and lowered his head again. He had already endured an hour of torture, but he still didn't speak. Alan had stopped by several times to try to persuade him to talk, but he had kept his mouth shut. It didn't matter how much they tortured him or pleaded with him about justice. Oscar remained as resolute as stone. He was determined not to speak. "Sometimes, even if you don't say anything, it's still a kind of answer," Charles said. He stared into Oscar's eyes. "When I look at you, I see unwavering confidence, sure as the sunrise tomorrow. Even I can't argue with conviction like that. Do you really have so much confidence in Leonard?" Oscar was as still and silent as a statue. He didn't admit or deny anything. "I don't know why you're so hell-bent on protecting him," Charles continued. "I can tell that the Leonard I've seen on the battlefield isn't someone worth protecting with your life. Owen shouldn't have sacrificed himself for Leonard's sake either, and since that coward isn't worth it, then there must be someone else you want to protect." He eyed Oscar carefully. "You know what I think? I think you're really trying to protect some other young genius. Perhaps he's using a code name, and appearances are easy enough to change. But I'm curious about one thing. Why didn't you let this other person lead the Shaw family's mission from the very beginning?" Something in Oscar's eyes flashed. He trembled almost imperceptibly for a moment, and then he stilled so quickly, it seemed like it might have been an illusion. But that reaction was exactly what Charles had been waiting for. The Leonard he had met in his previous life had been powerful, emotionless, and insufferably arrogant. He had been willing to sacrifice anything to achieve his goal. But the Leonard in Charles's new life couldn't have been more different. From the moment Charles had started suspecting that something about Leonard was off, something had bothered him. If the Leonard who had been fighting against the Allied army was a fake, then why hadn't the Shaw family supported the real Leonard from the beginning? Charles thought that perhaps they were only using this Leonard as a decoy or a shield. But even if that were the case, the jig was up, and Charles didn't understand why they were still pretending. He didn't see any benefit to continuing the charade, and wondered why they hadn't already revealed the real Leonard they had wanted to lead them all along. It didn't make any sense. No matter the reason, their continued support of the fake Leonard proved one thing: that the Shaw family had placed all their hopes on him, at least on the surface. Even though he was weak, they still believed he had boundless potential. Charles thought he must have had some sort of strength or talent that made people trust him. Another thing that didn't make sense to Charles was the existence of the Shaw brothers, Owen and Oscar. He didn't know much about them because they hadn't been around in his previous life. With their talents, they would have been well known. But since he had never heard of them, they must have already been dead. He wondered how they had died. Perhaps both of them had perished together in the war they were now fighting. In the future, when Leonard launched his plan, he would defeat all his enemies. Charles knew he would be an unstoppable force. It was unlikely that both of Leonard's uncles would die in battle at the same time, unless he killed them himself. "Since you don't want to tell me, let me guess," Charles said. "Your family is full of generals who protect the country. If you've placed your hope in someone, it wouldn't be because of his strength. Your family has plenty of that. You would support someone charming who had a good temperament. Leonard doesn't seem to match that description, yet you've all placed your hopes for the future in his hands. You have no doubts about him." He narrowed his eyes. "I can guess why. Leonard must have something that can change his temperament in precisely the ways you need. But even if he's strong and has a good temperament, no one will trust him if he acts like a fool. So he must also have something that can give him wisdom." Oscar trembled once again. He tried to hide the involuntary movement, but he couldn't. He hadn't thought Charles would ever make such a guess. "Strength, temperament, wisdom," Charles went on. "Changing these things is simple, but not easy. It takes both education and experiences of failure. But it seems impossible that a family of generals would bet everything on the ability to nurture such qualities. Either you've made a desperate gamble, or you already know how all this will turn out. You already know what the finished product will be, don't you?" Oscar shuddered again. He couldn't suppress it no matter how hard he tried. "Things are bleak right now," Charles continued, "but the world hasn't yet reached the point of total despair. You all must have received information about the future ahead of time, but let's set that possibility aside for now. It's not like you've borrowed a dead man's soul with some special powers to help you or something, right?" He was partially joking, but fear flashed across Oscar's face. He had been tortured for an hour and hadn't said a word, but at that moment, he was visibly afraid and perhaps surprised. Charles wondered if that was because his guesses were close to the truth. He crossed his legs and stared at Oscar. Then he turned his head and said, "Possession or rebirth doesn't quite fit the picture here. Besides, there are ways to kill an unattached soul. Is it soul fusion then? You guys hold Leonard in such high regard now. Are you trying to change his personality in a certain way to make it easier for his soul to merge with another? But then what'll happen to the other soul after it's been fused? Is it a soul from another world or another time? Or is it maybe an ancient book or inheritance guarded by the Shaw family? If something like that is all it takes to make someone a savior, then saviors are a dime a dozen in this world." There was a hint of mockery in Charles's tone. He sounded like he didn't really believe what he was saying. "You may be foolish, but you wouldn't sacrifice so many people without a plan. I know you've been hiding a special power." "Impossible," Oscar blurted out. "I don't believe it." "What's not to believe?" Charles said casually. "I've been hiding something too. Why do you think I have so many weapons? Why do you think the Knights of Hell are under my command? Don't you know where my cavalry came from? Why do you think I can summon Cerberuses?" As he spoke, he gave Oscar a teasing look. "You don't think I accomplished all this by myself, do you? It'd be great if that were the case. Then I really would be the savior of the world." "Impossible! You don't understand anything!" Oscar shouted. "You don't know what'll happen in the future." Let's see," Charles mused. He counted the major events of the future with his fingers. "What do we face? The Beast Tide in the summer, the lackluster moon in the following spring, the change in the blood moon in late summer, and the glacier era in the winter. Oh, and let's not forget the Great Collision, the invasion of Hell, the tsunami, and the undead calamity." Charles had exaggerated some of the minor events, but Oscar's face grew paler with each event he named. "How do you know all these things?" Oscar stammered. His eyes were wide, and he was filled with an intense fear he had never felt before. He had stayed strong through an hour of torture, but it didn't matter that he hadn't spoken. Charles was about to find out everything anyway. Oscar knew about a few of the things Charles had mentioned, but he'd never even heard of some of them. But because he could verify some of them, he didn't doubt that the others were true as well. Charles clearly knew more about the future than he did. Oscar wondered how he knew such secrets. Like I said, Charles continued, a lot of strange things have been happening. The world is full of despair. Some people can predict the future. What's so strange about that? Where do you think my equipment came from? Why do you think I was able to sign a contract with the Cerberus Pack? Why do you think Lewis and I have so many superpowers? Do you really think it's possible for someone to develop so many superpowers in such a short time? He still hadn't admitted anything definite, but Oscar could guess what he was getting at. I've encountered the inheritance of the ancient water mansion, Charles boasted. Of course, I'm not the one fated to receive it. I've also met the inheritor of the divine spirit of the underworld. It isn't difficult for the experts there to predict the future of our world. Some of them treat Earth like a game board with humans as the pieces, and we have no way to resist their machinations. A friend of mine found a new world that humans could move to, but it was too small to sustain very many people. That's why we couldn't give up our home easily. But since there was a way out, perhaps we should have given up everything. He uncrossed his legs and kept talking. Do you think I came to Washington and destroyed the statue of the underworld god by chance? Was it also by chance that I exploited the weakness of the Nether Knights? No. It was because my people in Dawn City observed the changes in the gate here. As Charles spoke, Oscar felt as if he was being stabbed in the heart with a knife. Compared to all of Charles's knowledge, what he knew was insignificant. He had placed all his hopes in Leonard, but now that seemed like a stupid idea. He wanted to refute Charles's words, but he couldn't. He thought the story Charles was telling had to be a combination of reality and illusion. How else could all the strange things he said be explained? Oscar let out a bark of hysterical laughter. No, I won't believe it. I refuse. He felt as if the foundation for all his beliefs had been struck by lightning. Everything he had put his faith in seemed ridiculous now. He had thought he had to save the country, even if it meant compromising his morals in the process. He had borne the burden of darkness all alone, hoping for just a glimmer of light. But at that moment, he realized that it had all been a scam. He was just a fool who had been deceived. Many people had knowledge of the future, and had used that knowledge to manufacture fortuitous encounters to make themselves look like saviors. What have I been doing all this time? He wondered. Oscar looked on the verge of collapse. He had clearly reached his limit. Charles sighed. He felt that destroying someone's beliefs was cruel, but he had had to do it. Whether it was for himself, for the righteousness of the nation, or for the people around him, he had to trample his enemy's pride. He wanted to protect his people, those who had sacrificed their lives for him in his previous life, and establish a nation that could survive, even if that nation was stained with blood. He wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who stood in his way, but he wasn't quite done with Oscar yet. It's a pity, though, Charles said. People like us who have had fortunate circumstances don't usually come from very favorable backgrounds. We have to climb our way up level by level. It wasn't easy to get someone like Kevin. His family was very powerful, but they didn't want anyone without special abilities to be as powerful as they were. They disowned him, and we helped him get revenge later. But many things were destroyed in the process, and we lost out on the advantages his family would have given us. If we could unite with someone monstrously powerful who has the same goals as we do, then things would be much easier. Oscar thought about what Charles was saying. With every word, more of his beliefs crumbled. He considered what it would be like for all the people with monstrous power to work together, realizing that surely there were thousands of such people in the world. He wanted to find the flaws in Charles's logic, but he couldn't. He was a general, and he had studied these matters before. He had enough inside information that he knew he couldn't refute anything Charles had said. It seemed to him as if predicting the future was no more difficult for Charles than simply watching the clouds in the sky. Oscar felt like he was moving forward with heavy weights tied to his limbs, while Charles had no obstacles at all. Charles quietly pressed his hand to Oscar's forehead and said, "Memory amulet, activate." The memory amulet allowed the user to search a person's mind for memories, but it could only be activated when the subject's mind was weak and made no resistance.